You feel overwhelmed by workplace pressures that seem to multiply daily, and every setback shakes your confidence to its core. The stress is affecting your sleep, your health, and your happiness outside of work, while anxiety follows you home and disrupts your most precious relationships. I am Marcus Aurelius, who maintained inner peace while ruling the most powerful empire in history and bearing the weight of millions of lives on my shoulders. Through my daily practice of Stoic Mindfulness, I discovered how to build a fortress of calm that no external pressure could penetrate, using the same philosophy that sustained emperors through plagues, wars, and the burden of absolute power. The mindfulness principles I'll share will transform how you respond to stress and setbacks, giving you the unshakable inner strength that turns pressure into power and chaos into clarity. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Stoic wisdom, and comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far the need for inner peace has spread across our modern world. Let me share with you what it truly means to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. When I assumed the purple of Rome, I inherited not just an empire, but the lives, hopes, and fears of 60 million souls. Every decision I made rippled across continents, affecting families I would never meet, children whose futures hung on my wisdom or folly. I remember my first morning as emperor, standing in the palatial chambers that had witnessed the rise and fall of so many before me. The golden laurel crown sat heavy on my brow, not from its physical weight, but from the crushing realization that I was now responsible for the greatest civilization the world had ever known. The irony was not lost on me. In gaining ultimate power, I had become the ultimate servant. The pressures you feel in your workplace, the deadlines that keep you awake at night, the politics that drain your energy, multiply these by the magnitude of governing an empire stretching from Britain to the Euphrates. Imagine making decisions where failure means not just personal disappointment, but famine for provinces, war for nations, death for thousands. During my reign, plague swept through the empire like wildfire. The Antonine Plague, as historians would later call it, decimated our population, while I watched helplessly as entire cities emptied. Simultaneously, Germanic tribes pressed our northern borders, sensing weakness in our suffering. I found myself commanding armies while bodies piled in the streets of Rome, making strategic decisions while my own adopted son succumbed to disease. The weight of it all could have crushed me entirely. There were nights when I would walk the palace corridors, unable to sleep, feeling the expectations of millions pressing down like a physical force. How do you find peace when every choice carries life or death consequences? How do you maintain sanity when the burden of leadership threatens to consume your very soul? Yet it was precisely in these moments of overwhelming pressure that I discovered the necessity of inner fortification. I realized that if I allowed external circumstances to dictate my internal state, I would become useless not only to myself, but to those depending on me. The empire needed an emperor who could think clearly, act decisively, and maintain perspective even when the world seemed to be ending. This is when I truly understood that the greatest battles are not fought on external battlefields, but within the citadel of our own minds. The plagues, the wars, the political intrigues, these were merely the stage upon which I would practice the most important skill any leader can develop, mastering oneself. In my private moments, writing in what you now know as my meditations, I began to develop the mental disciplines that would sustain me through the darkest periods of my reign. I learned that true power comes not from controlling others, but from controlling your own responses to uncontrollable circumstances. The external world would always present challenges, disease, war, betrayal, death. But my inner world could remain a fortress of tranquility if I built it with the right philosophical materials. This realization changed everything for me. Instead of seeing my imperial burdens as curses, I began to view them as the ultimate training ground for developing unshakable inner strength. Every crisis became an opportunity to practice what the philosophers had taught. Every setback a chance to prove that virtue could triumph over circumstances. Before I discovered Stoicism, I was drowning in the chaos of imperial responsibility. Like you might feel overwhelmed by your own pressures, I was reactive, emotional, and constantly at the mercy of external events. Every piece of bad news from the provinces sent me into anxiety. Every political challenge filled me with anger. Every personal loss devastated my ability to function as a leader. Then Junius Rusticus entered my life, my philosophy teacher who would fundamentally alter how I understood existence itself. He placed in my hands the writings of Epictetus, a former slave who had discovered freedom through philosophy. Imagine the irony. An emperor learning liberation from the words of a man who had lived in chains. Rusticus taught me to carry a simple stone in my pocket, nothing ornate or valuable, just a common piece of granite from the Roman countryside. This stone became my constant reminder of the foundational Stoic principle that would save my sanity, the dichotomy of control. Every time I felt my mind spiraling into anxiety or anger, I would touch that stone and ask myself the most important question I have ever learned: is this within my control or outside my control? Through Epictetus, I discovered that most of our suffering comes from trying to control what we cannot control, while neglecting what we can control. You cannot control whether your boss appreciates your work, but you can control the quality of effort you put forth. You cannot control whether others treat you fairly, but you can control how you respond to unfairness. You cannot control whether you get promoted, but you can control whether you develop skills worthy of promotion. The three disciplines of Stoicism became my daily practice. The discipline of desire taught me to want what happens rather than demand that what I want should happen. Instead of raging against the plague that devastated my empire, I learned to work with the reality I faced, finding opportunities for compassion and resilience within catastrophe. The discipline of action showed me how to do my duty regardless of external outcomes. Whether negotiating with hostile Germanic tribes or comforting plague victims in Roman streets, I learned to focus on acting with virtue, justice, courage, wisdom, and temperance without attachment to specific results. This freed me from the paralysis that comes from trying to guarantee outcomes beyond my influence. The discipline of assent revolutionized how I processed information and emotions. Instead of automatically accepting every initial impression or emotional reaction, I learned to examine my thoughts before allowing them to become beliefs. When a messenger brought news of military defeat, instead of immediately descending into despair, I would pause and ask, what facts do I actually know? What assumptions am I adding? How can I respond most constructively? This philosophical transformations did not happen overnight. There were countless moments when I reverted to old patterns, when anger flared at incompetent advisors, when grief threatened to overwhelm me after losing loved ones, when the weight of responsibility made me want to abandon everything and retreat to a simple life. But gradually, through daily practice and constant self-examination, these principles became second nature. I began to understand that external events are neutral until we add our interpretations to them. A military defeat is just information, until we make it mean something about our worth as leaders. A difficult conversation with a family member is just words and tones until we decide it represents rejection or conflict. The plague was just a biological reality until I chose to see it as either divine punishment or an opportunity to practice courage and compassion. What struck me most profoundly was realizing that this philosophy was not theoretical, it was intensely practical. During the Germanic Wars, when I spent years on the frontier, living in military camps rather than palatial comfort, Stoicism sustained me. When my son Commodus showed signs of the tyrannical tendencies that would later corrupt his reign, Stoicism helped me love him while accepting my inability to control his choices. The philosophy taught me that happiness is not the absence of problems, but the presence of perspective. Peace is not found in perfect circumstances, but in perfect acceptance of imperfect circumstances. Strength is not the ability to avoid suffering, but the capacity to suffer well, to extract meaning, growth, and virtue from whatever life presents. Every morning before dawn, while the palace still slept, and the weight of imperial duties had not yet descended upon my shoulders, I practiced the most important ritual of my day. I would rise and stand before my bronze mirror, not to admire my reflection, but to prepare my mind for whatever challenges the day might bring. This mirror became my tool for honest self-examination. Looking into my own eyes each morning, I would remind myself that I was about to encounter difficult people, ungrateful subjects, incompetent advisors, and unexpected crises. Rather than hoping for a perfect day, I prepared for an imperfect one. This was not pessimism. It was practical wisdom that prevented disappointment and equipped me with mental resilience. I would begin by setting my intentions clearly. Today, I told myself I will focus on what I can control, my responses, my effort, my virtue, my choices. I will not waste energy lamenting what others do or fail to do. I will not exhaust myself demanding that reality conform to my preferences. Instead, I will work skillfully with whatever situations arise, using them as opportunities to practice philosophy in action. Each morning, I reminded myself of death's inevitability, not to become morbid, but to maintain perspective on what truly matters. This day might be my last, so how do I want to spend it? Worried about things beyond my control? Angry at people for being human? Or focused on living and leading with virtue, contributing something meaningful to the world? While I have the chance, I would also prepare myself mentally for specific challenges I knew were coming. If I had a difficult meeting with the Senate, I would visualize myself remaining calm regardless of their behavior. If I needed to make an unpopular decision about taxation or military conscription, I would mentally rehearse staying committed to what was right rather than what was popular. This mental preparation was like armor for my soul. The most crucial part of my morning routine was setting realistic expectations. I reminded myself that people would act according to their own reasoning, not mine. Senators would prioritize their political interests. Generals would sometimes provide inaccurate information to protect their reputations. Citizens would complain about policies designed to help them. By expecting human nature to be human nature, I could respond to it with patience rather than outrage. I learned to use these quiet morning moments to connect with my deepest values. What kind of emperor did I want to be today? What kind of father, husband, friend? How could I embody the virtues of justice, courage, wisdom, and temperance in my specific responsibilities? This wasn't abstract philosophical speculation. It was practical preparation for real-world application. The morning ritual also included gratitude practice. Before focusing on problems I needed to solve, I acknowledged gifts I had received, the privilege of serving in a position where I could potentially improve millions of lives, the wisdom of philosophers who had shared their insights across centuries, the loyalty of friends who supported me through difficulties, the simple fact of being alive in an extraordinary time and place. I discovered that how I started my day determined how I experienced my day. When I rushed into imperial duties without this philosophical preparation, I remained reactive, pushed around by circumstances, other people's moods, and unexpected events. But when I began with intentional reflection, I moved through challenges with greater equanimity and effectiveness. This practice taught me that we always have a choice in how we meet each day. We can stumble into it unconsciously, allowing external events to dictate our internal state, or we can enter it deliberately, armed with perspective and prepared to respond rather than react. The morning preparation ritual became my daily opportunity to choose philosophy over impulse, wisdom over emotion, and virtue over convenience. In my private study, I kept an hourglass, not to track appointments or measure productivity, but to remind myself of the most profound truth I ever learned. This moment is all we truly possess. Watching those grains of sand fall one by one taught me that the present moment is where all power, peace, and possibility reside. Like you, I struggled with a mind that constantly wandered. During important state meetings, I would find myself worrying about Germanic tribes massing on our borders instead of listening to the current speaker. While reviewing legal cases, my thoughts would drift to personal grief over my deceased children rather than focusing on the justice I needed to dispense. This mental fragmentation made me less effective as a leader and less peaceful as a human being. The practice of present moment awareness began with a simple recognition. Anxiety exists only when we project ourselves into an imagined future, and regret exists only when we relive an unchangeable past. In the actual present moment, this breath, this heartbeat, this immediate experience, there is usually peace, even amid external chaos. I learned to anchor myself in the present through what I called the discipline of attention. During conversations, I would focus completely on the person speaking, noticing not just their words, but their tone, their body language, their underlying concerns. This total presence made me a better listener and more effective in addressing their real needs rather than just their surface requests. When walking through the palace corridors, instead of mentally rehearsing upcoming meetings or replaying past conversations, I would pay attention to my footsteps, the texture of marble. Beneath my feet, the way light streamed through the windows. This simple practice transformed routine activities into opportunities for mindfulness and mental centering. During the most stressful periods of my reign, when plague ravaged the empire and barbarian armies threatened our borders simultaneously, I discovered that breaking overwhelming situations into present moment components made them manageable. Instead of feeling crushed by the enormity of imperial crisis, I would focus on the single decision in front of me right now. What is the one action I can take in this moment that aligns with virtue and moves us forward? I developed specific techniques for returning to the present. When my mind wandered into anxiety or regret, I would feel my feet on the ground, notice my breathing, or observe 3 specific details in my immediate environment. These simple anchors pulled me back from mental time travel into the reality of now, where I could actually think clearly and act effectively. The hourglass taught me that time is not something we have, it is something we are. We exist only in this flowing moment, never in the past that is gone or the future that may never come. Every grain of sand represents an opportunity to choose our response, to align with virtue, to experience whatever life is offering without the mental commentary that usually accompanies it. During military campaigns, this present moment awareness became crucial for survival and success. In battle, commanders who are thinking about yesterday's defeat or tomorrow's strategy get killed. Victory requires complete presence, awareness of terrain, weather, troop movements, enemy positions, all happening right now. The same principle applies to the battles of daily life. I learned that present moment awareness does not mean ignoring the past or future entirely. Planning and learning from experience are essential. But there is a difference between conscious, intentional reflection and unconscious mental wandering. I could deliberately review past decisions to extract wisdom, then return to the present. I could thoughtfully plan future strategies, then come back to now. The key was maintaining conscious choice about where to place my attention. The most profound discovery was that presence is not just a mental technique. It is a doorway to wisdom. When we are fully present, we see situations more clearly, understand people more deeply, and respond more skillfully. The noise of mental chatter quiets, allowing our natural intelligence and compassion to emerge. This practice transformed my experience of both pleasure and pain. Instead of grasping at pleasant moments, trying to make them permanent, I learned to experience them fully while accepting their temporary nature. Instead of resisting difficult moments, fighting against their reality, I learned to meet them with presence and extract whatever wisdom they offered. Present moment awareness became my refuge during the darkest periods of imperial responsibility. No matter how overwhelming the external situation, I could always return to this breath, this heartbeat, this immediate experience of being alive and conscious in an extraordinary universe. During the siege of Sirmium, I watched our engineers transform a massive enemy wall designed to keep us out into the very means of our victory. They used the siege ladder not just to scale the obstacle, but to position it as a bridge that became our pathway to triumph. This image burned itself into my mind as the perfect metaphor for the most transformative principle I ever learned. The impediment becomes the way. You face obstacles every day that seem designed to block your progress, difficult colleagues who resist your ideas, projects that encounter unexpected complications, personal setbacks that derail your plans. Like me, your first instinct is probably to see these as problems to be overcome or avoided. But what if I told you that these very obstacles contain the seeds of your greatest opportunities? When the Antonine Plague swept through our empire, killing millions and devastating our economy, my initial response was despair. How could any good come from such widespread suffering? Yet this catastrophe forced me to develop crisis management skills that served the empire for decades. It compelled me to create new administrative systems for emergency response. It taught me deeper compassion for human suffering and strengthened my resolve to serve others above myself. The plague became my teacher in ways that peace and prosperity never could have been. It stripped away illusions about control and permanence, forcing me to develop the very philosophical resilience that would define my reign. Without that obstacle, I might have remained a comfortable but shallow leader, never discovering the depths of strength and wisdom that crisis demanded. I learned to ask different questions when facing difficulties. Instead of, "Why is this happening?" to me, I began asking, "How is this happening for me?" Instead of, "How can I avoid this problem?" I started wondering, "What can this problem teach me?" This shift in perspective transformed every setback from a source of frustration into a source of growth. During the Germanic Wars, when I spent years on the frontier living in military tents rather than imperial palaces, I initially saw this as a terrible disruption of my life. I was a philosopher emperor forced to become a warrior emperor, dragged away from my books and contemplation into the brutality of warfare. Yet those frontier years taught me lessons about leadership, resilience, and human nature that no amount of palace study could have provided. The discomfort of military life taught me that luxury is not necessary for happiness. The constant threat of death taught me to appreciate each day as a gift. The responsibility for soldiers' lives taught me that true leadership means serving those you lead rather than being served by them. Every hardship became a curriculum in becoming a better human being. I developed what I came to think of as obstacle alchemy, the practice of transforming difficulties into advantages through perspective and response. When senators opposed my policies, instead of seeing this as political interference, I learned to view it as an opportunity to refine my ideas and build broader consensus. Their resistance forced me to become a more persuasive communicator and more thoughtful leader. When my adopted son Lucius Verus died unexpectedly, leaving me to govern alone, I could have become bitter about the loss of my partner in leadership. Instead, I used this tragedy to develop greater self-reliance and to appreciate more deeply the advisors and friends who remained. The obstacle of solitude became the opportunity for deeper personal growth and more authentic relationships. The key insight was recognizing that obstacles do not happen to us. They happen for us if we have the wisdom to use them correctly. Every difficulty is life's way of asking, "Are you strong enough to handle this? Are you wise enough to learn from this? Are you compassionate enough to help others facing similar challenges?" This principle applies to every level of life. The colleague who challenges your ideas forces you to think more clearly. The project that encounters complications teaches you problem-solving skills. The rejection that disappoints you redirects you toward better opportunities. The failure that embarrasses you develops humility and resilience. I began to understand that smooth paths rarely lead to greatness. It is the rough terrain that builds strength, the headwinds that develop endurance, the challenges that reveal character. Without obstacles, we remain untested and undeveloped, like muscles that never face resistance and therefore never grow stronger. The siege ladder taught me that the very thing blocking your path can become the very thing that elevates you, if you approach it with the right mindset and strategy. What seems like an impediment might actually be the universe's way of providing exactly the training you need for your next level of growth and contribution. In my private chambers, I kept a simple clay cup, unremarkable, unadorned, worth perhaps a few copper coins in any Roman market. Yet this humble vessel taught me one of the most liberating truths of human existence. Freedom comes not from getting what you want, but from wanting what you get. Before I understood the discipline of desire, I was a slave to my own expectations. I wanted the Germanic tribes to submit peacefully to Roman rule. I wanted the plague to spare my family and empire. I wanted my son Commodus to embrace philosophy and virtue as I had. I wanted senators to prioritize the common good over personal gain. My happiness depended entirely on reality conforming to my preferences, a recipe for constant frustration and disappointment. This clay cup became my daily reminder that contentment is an internal choice, not an external circumstance. When I drank from golden chalices at state banquets, I noticed no difference in the water's ability to quench my thirst. The elaborate vessel added nothing to the essential function. Similarly, I began to recognize that my desires for particular outcomes added nothing to my ability to live virtuously and serve effectively. The discipline of desire taught me to distinguish between what I prefer and what I require. I preferred that my military campaigns end quickly with minimal casualties, but I did not require this for my peace of mind. I preferred that my family members embrace Stoic philosophy, but I did not make my love for them conditional on their philosophical choices. This distinction freed me from the tyranny of attachment to specific outcomes. I learned to practice what Epictetus called the reserve clause, adding fate permitting to all my plans and expectations. Instead of saying, I will conquer Germania, I would think, I will conquer Germania, fate permitting. This simple mental adjustment prepared me for both success and failure, allowing me to pursue goals wholeheartedly while remaining emotionally detached from results. The most challenging aspect of this discipline was learning to desire what I already had rather than constantly seeking more. As emperor, I possessed virtually unlimited material wealth and power, yet I often found myself wanting different circumstances, better advisors, more cooperative enemies, less complex problems. The clay cup reminded me daily that satisfaction comes from appreciating present reality, not from acquiring future possibilities. This practice transformed my relationship with suffering. Instead of fighting against difficult emotions or trying to escape painful situations, I learned to accept them as natural parts of human experience. When grief arose after losing loved ones, I allowed it to flow through me without resistance. When anger surfaced in response to betrayal or incompetence, I acknowledged it without being controlled by it. I discovered that the root of all emotional suffering is the gap between what we want and what we have. When we want things to be different from how they are, we create internal conflict and distress. But when we learn to want what is already present, to desire what actually happens rather than demanding that what we desire should happen, we find peace regardless of external circumstances. This did not mean becoming passive or abandoning all preferences. I still worked diligently to improve the empire, protect citizens, and uphold justice. But I learned to hold these goals lightly, pursuing them with full effort while accepting whatever results emerged. My satisfaction came from the virtue of my actions, not from their external outcomes. The discipline of desire also taught me to appreciate impermanence rather than fighting against it. Everything I loved, my family, my empire, my own life, was temporary. Instead of making this reality a source of anxiety, I learned to see it as what made each moment precious. Because I knew my time with loved ones was limited, I treasured our interactions more fully. Because I understood my reign would end, I focused on making the most positive impact possible while I could. I began to understand that desire itself is not the problem. Attachment to desire is what creates suffering. I could prefer certain outcomes without demanding them. I could work toward goals without defining my worth by achieving them. I could love people without possessing them. This subtle but profound shift freed me from the exhausting cycle of grasping and disappointment that had previously defined my emotional life. The clay cup taught me that true wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants. True power consists not in controlling external events, but in not being controlled by them. True freedom consists not in getting whatever you desire, but in desiring whatever you get, finding reasons to appreciate reality as it unfolds rather than demanding it unfold according to your preferences. Every evening, I would take up my ivory stylus and carefully record my thoughts on parchment, not for posterity, but for self-examination. This practice of writing revealed something extraordinary. I was not my thoughts. I was the consciousness observing my thoughts. This discovery revolutionized how I understood the human mind and gave me power over the very voice that had previously controlled my emotional life. Before developing this awareness, I was at the mercy of whatever narrative my mind created about events. When a messenger brought news of military setbacks, my immediate thoughts would spiral. This defeat proves I'm an incompetent commander. The empire is doomed. I've failed my ancestors and subjects. These thoughts felt like absolute truth, and I would respond emotionally based on their content. But through careful observation with my stylus, I began to notice patterns in my thinking. I saw how my mind automatically interpreted neutral events through the lens of fear, judgment, and assumption. A delayed response from a provincial governor became evidence of rebellion. A senator's yawn during my speech became proof of disrespect. My mind was constantly adding dramatic commentary to simple facts. I learned to catch my thoughts in the act of creation. When anxiety arose about Germanic tribal movements, instead of automatically believing the fearful narrative, I would pause and examine it. What did I actually know? What assumptions was I adding? How was this mental story affecting my ability to respond effectively? This simple practice of observation created space between stimulus and response. The most powerful technique I developed was questioning my initial interpretations. When my mind declared this situation is terrible, I would ask, is it terrible or is it simply challenging? Is it truly a disaster or is it an opportunity I haven't recognized yet? When thoughts arose like, that person is my enemy, I would inquire, are they actually my enemy or are they simply acting from their own perspective and interests? I discovered that most of our suffering comes not from events themselves, but from the meanings we assign to events. The Germanic tribes crossing our borders was just information until I decided it meant something about my competence as emperor. My son's philosophical disinterest was just his personal choice until I interpreted it as a reflection of my failure as a father. Through this practice, I learned to separate facts from interpretations. Facts: a senator spoke harshly during debate. Interpretation: he disrespects me personally and threatens my authority. By recognizing this distinction, I could respond to the fact, address his concerns constructively rather than react to my interpretation, feel personally attacked and respond defensively. The inner dialogue often masqueraded as wisdom while actually being fear, pride, or assumption. When facing difficult decisions, my mind would present elaborate justifications for choices that served my ego rather than the common good. Learning to recognize these mental patterns allowed me to make decisions based on virtue rather than emotion. Developed what I called the observer self, the part of consciousness that watches thoughts arise and pass away without being swept along by them. This observer could notice when my mind was catastrophizing about the future, ruminating about the past, or creating stories about other people's motivations. From this perspective, thoughts became temporary visitors rather than permanent residents. 1. Of the most liberating realizations was that I didn't have to believe every thought my mind produced. Thoughts are like clouds passing through the sky of consciousness, sometimes dark and stormy, sometimes light and pleasant, but always temporary and not necessarily accurate reflections of reality. I could acknowledge a fearful thought without being controlled by it, notice an angry thought without acting on it. This practice proved invaluable during the most stressful periods of my reign. When multiple crises threatened the empire simultaneously, my mind would generate endless worst-case scenarios and self-doubt. But instead of being paralyzed by these mental productions, I could observe them, extract any useful information they contained, and then focus on taking constructive action based on facts rather than fears. I learned to consciously direct my inner dialogue toward more helpful narratives. Instead of, "Why do these problems keep happening to me?" I would think, "How can I use this challenge to develop greater wisdom and virtue?" Instead of, "I can't handle this responsibility," I would reflect, "This is exactly the kind of situation that will help me grow into the leader my people need." The stylist taught me that we are not passive victims of our thoughts. We are active participants in our mental life. We can choose which thoughts to pursue and develop, which ones to question and dismiss, and which ones to transform into more helpful perspectives. This capacity to consciously shape our inner dialogue is perhaps the most practical form of power any person can develop. Through mastering my inner dialogue, I found that external events lost much of their power to disturb my peace. When someone criticized my policies instead of my mind automatically generating defensive stories, I could listen for valid points while maintaining confidence in my intentions. When faced with setbacks instead of catastrophic thinking, I could focus on constructive responses and lessons to be learned. In my private study, I kept an ivory chess set that taught me the difference between caring deeply and being emotionally attached. As I moved the pieces across the board, I cared intensely about strategy and winning, yet I remained detached from the outcome. Whether I won or lost the game had no bearing on my identity or self-worth. This distinction between engagement and attachment became one of the most sophisticated skills I developed as both emperor and human being. When I first became emperor, I confused caring with attachment. I thought that to truly love my family meant I had to control their choices. I believed that serving the empire required me to guarantee specific outcomes. I assumed that being a good leader meant ensuring that everyone approved of my decisions. This confusion made me anxious, controlling, and ultimately less effective in all my relationships and responsibilities. Philosophical detachment taught me that I could love my son Commodus completely while accepting that I could not control his character development. I could care deeply about the empire's welfare while recognizing that many factors affecting its future lay beyond my influence. I could be fully committed to just governance while remaining peaceful when others criticized my policies. The key insight was understanding that attachment creates suffering while care creates wisdom. When I was attached to my son becoming a philosopher like me, every sign of his disinterest in virtue became a source of personal pain. But when I learned to care for his well-being without being attached to his specific choices, I could support him more effectively while maintaining my own inner peace. This practice revolutionized my approach to military campaigns. I cared intensely about protecting Roman citizens and maintaining stability on our borders. I invested enormous energy, resources, and strategic thinking into these efforts. But I learned to remain detached from specific battlefield outcomes, understanding that factors beyond my control, weather, disease, enemy decisions, pure chance, would always influence results. Detachment did not mean indifference or emotional numbness. During the plague years, I felt deep compassion for suffering citizens. I grieved genuinely when loved ones died. I experienced appropriate anger when advisors betrayed their responsibilities. But I learned to feel these emotions fully without being controlled by them, to let them inform my responses without dictating my choices. I discovered that attachment actually diminishes our effectiveness in relationships and responsibilities. When I was attached to senators agreeing with my proposals, I became manipulative, trying to control their responses rather than simply presenting the best arguments I could. When I was attached to specific military victories, I sometimes made poor strategic decisions based on ego rather than wisdom. The chess set taught me to approach life like a skilled player approaches the game, fully engaged, strategically thoughtful, emotionally invested in playing well, but not devastated by losses or intoxicated by wins. Each move mattered deeply in the moment, but the outcome of any single game did not define my identity as a player. I learned to practice what I called loving detachment in my most intimate relationships. With my wife, Faustina, I could love her completely while accepting that I could not control her moods, choices, or responses. This acceptance actually deepened our connection because she felt loved for who she was, rather than pressured to become who I wanted her to be. In governance, philosophical detachment allowed me to make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by the need for universal approval. When I had to raise taxes to fund military defenses, I could care deeply about citizens' financial burdens while remaining detached from their inevitable complaints. The policy was necessary for collective security, and their temporary anger was a natural response I could accept without taking personally. This practice taught me the difference between healthy concern and toxic worry. Healthy concern motivates constructive action. If I care about provincial stability, I develop better administrative systems. Toxic worry creates mental suffering without improving outcomes. If I'm attached to provincial perfection, I lie awake anxiously, obsessing about problems I cannot directly solve. Detachment also freed me from the exhausting cycle of emotional highs and lows that had previously characterized my leadership. When military campaigns succeeded, I could appreciate the victory without becoming overconfident. When they failed, I could learn from setbacks without becoming despondent. My emotional equilibrium became less dependent on external circumstances and more rooted in internal virtue. I began to understand that true love for people, ideals, or responsibilities actually requires detachment. When we are attached to specific outcomes, we often act from fear, need, or ego rather than genuine care. But when we love without attachment, we can respond to situations from wisdom and compassion rather than anxiety and control. The most profound realization was that detachment enhanced rather than diminished my capacity for service. When I stopped needing the empire to validate my worth, I could serve it more purely. When I stopped demanding that family members fulfill my expectations, I could love them more authentically. The chess pieces taught me that caring without grasping creates the spaciousness necessary for wisdom, effectiveness, and genuine connection. On my desk lay the imperial seal, a symbol of authority that ironically taught me the most important lesson about powerlessness. Despite commanding legions and governing an empire, I could not control the most challenging aspect of leadership, other people's behavior. The seal reminded me daily that true diplomatic mastery comes not from making people do what you want, but from maintaining your virtue regardless of what they choose to do. every morning. I would prepare myself mentally for encounters with what most would call difficult people. Senators motivated by personal ambition rather than public service. Generals who inflated their victories and minimized their defeats. Provincial governors who cared more about wealth accumulation than effective administration. Early in my reign, I exhausted myself trying to change these people, convinced that if I could just find the right words or incentives, they would transform into the virtuous collaborators I needed. The breakthrough came when I realized that people are not difficult. They are simply acting according to their own reasoning, values, and circumstances. The senator who opposes my policy is not trying to frustrate me personally. He is protecting what he perceives as his constituents' interests or his own political survival. The advisor who gives me incomplete information is not deliberately sabotaging my decisions. He is managing his own fears about delivering unwelcome news. This shift in perspective changed everything. Instead of taking other people's behavior personally, I began to see it as information about their internal state, their priorities, their fears, and their understanding of the situation. A hostile response during negotiations told me about their sense of threat or insecurity. A defensive reaction to feedback revealed their struggle with perfectionism or self-worth. This understanding allowed me to respond with strategy rather than react with emotion. I developed what I came to think of as compassionate boundaries. I could understand why someone acted from fear, greed, or ego without allowing their behavior to compromise my own principles. When a provincial governor embezzled funds intended for plague relief, I could recognize that his actions stemmed from panic about his family's financial security while still holding him accountable for the consequences. The most challenging relationships were with family members who seemed determined to disappoint my hopes for them. My son Commodus showed early signs of the cruelty and self-indulgence that would later define his reign. My initial response was to intensify my efforts to shape his character through lectures, examples, and consequences. The harder I tried to control his development, the more he resisted and the more frustrated I became. Learning to love Commodus without trying to control him was perhaps my greatest personal victory. I could express my values clearly, provide guidance when requested, and maintain appropriate boundaries around his behavior, but I had to accept that his character choices were ultimately his own. This acceptance did not mean abandoning my role. As father, it meant fulfilling that role more skillfully. I discovered that most interpersonal conflicts arise from unspoken expectations and assumptions. When I expected senators to prioritize collective welfare over personal gain, I set myself up for disappointment and them for failure. When I assumed that advisors shared my philosophical commitment to truth-telling, I became frustrated by their political calculations. Clarifying expectations and accepting human nature as it is, rather than as I wished it to be transformed, my working relationships. The practice of responding rather than reacting became crucial for maintaining effectiveness with challenging personalities. When someone attacked my policies in the Senate, my initial impulse was always defensive, to justify my decisions and counterattack their motives. But I learned to pause, breathe, and ask myself, what response would be most constructive here? How can I address their legitimate concerns while maintaining my principles? I found that difficult people often serve as our greatest teachers. The senator who consistently opposed me forced me to develop more persuasive arguments and consider perspectives I might have overlooked. The advisor who sugar-coated bad news taught me to ask better questions and create safer environments for truth-telling. The family member who rejected my values helped me practice unconditional love and acceptance. The imperial seal taught me that true authority comes not from making others comply with your will, but from maintaining your integrity, regardless of their choices. I could not control whether senators would support wise policies, but I could control whether I continued proposing them. I could not guarantee that advisors would be completely honest, but I could ensure that my own communications were truthful and clear. This approach dramatically reduced the emotional drain of leadership. Instead of feeling personally attacked when people disagreed with me, I could focus on understanding their perspectives and finding common ground where possible. Instead of becoming bitter about human selfishness and short-sightedness, I could appreciate the complexity of motivations and the universality of struggle. The most profound realization was that changing myself was both easier and more effective than trying to change others. When I became less defensive, people felt safer being honest with me. When I practiced more patience, they were less likely to respond with hostility. When I demonstrated genuine concern for their well-being, they were more willing to consider my perspective. The diplomatic seal reminded me that influence flows from character, not position. As darkness fell over the empire each night, I would light a simple oil lamp and enter into the most honest conversation of my day, the one with myself. This evening reflection became my daily opportunity for growth, accountability, and preparation for tomorrow's challenges. The gentle flame provided just enough light for writing while creating an atmosphere of intimacy and introspection that harsh daylight could never offer. The evening review was not an exercise in self-punishment or regret. Rather, it was a practice of philosophical archaeology, carefully examining the day's events to extract wisdom and identify patterns. I would ask myself specific questions designed to promote learning rather than judgment. What situations triggered my strongest emotional reactions today? When did I respond from virtue versus when did I react from impulse? What lessons did difficult people or challenging circumstances offer me? I learned to approach these reflections with the same objectivity I might use to analyze a military campaign. When reviewing a tactical defeat, a good general does not waste energy on self-condemnation. He identifies what went wrong, what went right, and how to improve future performance. Similarly, when examining my daily choices and responses, I focused on understanding and learning rather than praising or blaming myself. One question I found particularly valuable was, if I could relive this day, what would I do differently? This was not an invitation to regret or self-criticism, but an opportunity to mentally rehearse better responses for similar future situations. If I had spoken harshly to an advisor out of frustration, I would visualize how I might have expressed the same concerns with more patience and clarity. The evening practice also included examining my motivations and intentions. Had I made decisions based on virtue or ego? When I chose to implement a particular policy, was I serving the common good or protecting my reputation? When I responded to criticism, was I seeking truth or defending my pride? This honest self-examination helped me recognize subtle patterns of self-deception that could corrupt my leadership. I found great value in reviewing not just my actions, but my thoughts and emotions throughout the day. What fears had influenced my thinking? What assumptions had I made without sufficient evidence? When had I allowed anxiety about future events to distract me from present responsibilities? This mental review helped me understand the connection between my inner life and outer effectiveness. The practice of gratitude became an essential component of these evening sessions. Before focusing on areas for improvement, I would acknowledge what had gone well, what gifts I had received, what progress I had made. This was not superficial positive thinking, but a deliberate cultivation of perspective that prevented the review from becoming an exercise in self-criticism. I would reflect on specific moments of virtue I had witnessed or practiced. Perhaps a soldier had shown exceptional courage, or an advisor had delivered unwelcome news with admirable honesty, or I had maintained patience during a particularly frustrating Senate session. These observations reminded me that virtue is always possible and always present, even in difficult circumstances. The evening lamp also illuminated my relationships and interactions with others. How well had I listened to people today? When had I been fully present versus when had I been distracted or judgmental? Had I contributed to greater understanding and cooperation, or had I increased tension and division? These reflections helped me become more conscious of my impact on others. One of the most powerful aspects of this practice was preparing my mind for restorative sleep. Instead of taking unresolved tensions and worries to bed, I would process them through philosophical reflection. If I had made a mistake, I would extract the lesson and plan for better choices tomorrow. If I was anxious about upcoming challenges, I would remind myself of my capacity to handle whatever arose with virtue and wisdom. The evening review taught me that growth is not automatic. It requires conscious reflection and intentional learning. Without this daily practice of examination, I could repeat the same mistakes endlessly, never recognizing patterns that undermined my effectiveness. But with consistent reflection, each day became a teacher, and each experience an opportunity for development. This practice also helped me maintain perspective on both successes and failures. When days went well, the evening reflection prevented overconfidence by acknowledging the role of circumstances beyond my control. When days were difficult, it prevented despair by focusing on lessons learned and progress made despite challenges. The gentle flame reminded me that consciousness itself is a light that can illuminate any experience, no matter how dark or confusing. Through careful attention and honest reflection, even our most difficult moments can become sources of wisdom and growth. In the construction of Rome's greatest fortifications, I learned that true strength comes not from rigid walls that crack under pressure, but from foundations built with both stone and mortar, solid enough to withstand assault, flexible enough to absorb impact without breaking. This principle guided my approach to building what I came to understand as the most important fortress of all: an unshakable mind that could maintain stability while the world convulsed around it. Mental resilience, I discovered, is not about becoming emotionally numb or pretending that difficulties don't affect you. During the darkest years of my reign, when plague killed millions, barbarian invasions threatened our borders, and political betrayals wounded my trust, I felt every blow deeply. The difference was that I learned to feel without being destroyed, to bend without breaking, to absorb impact without losing my essential center. The foundation of this inner fortress was built on the recognition that resilience is a skill, not a personality trait. Just as soldiers develop physical strength through progressive training, I developed mental strength through deliberate practice. Each challenge became an opportunity to test and strengthen my philosophical defenses, each setback a chance to prove that external circumstances could not determine my internal state. I learned to distinguish between what Stoics call initial impressions and considered judgments. When messengers brought news of military defeats, my initial impression was always fear and disappointment. But I trained myself to pause before allowing these emotions to become entrenched beliefs about the situation. The initial feeling was natural and temporary. What mattered was how I processed and responded to it. One technique that proved invaluable was what I called worst-case rehearsal. Instead of avoiding thoughts about potential disasters, I would deliberately imagine them in detail while practicing virtuous responses. If the empire fell, how would I maintain dignity in defeat? If I lost everything I valued, how would I find meaning in reduced circumstances? This mental preparation made actual challenges feel more manageable because I had already faced them. In imagination, the fortress walls of resilience were built through daily practices that strengthened my capacity to handle stress. Morning meditation prepared my mind for whatever the day might bring. Evening reflection helped me process difficulties without carrying them into sleep. Physical exercise taught me that discomfort is temporary and can be endured. Simple breathing practices provided immediate tools for managing acute anxiety or anger. I discovered that resilience requires both acceptance and agency, the wisdom to distinguish between what we can and cannot control. combined with fierce commitment to influencing what lies within our power. When plague ravaged the empire, I could not control the disease's spread, but I could control how effectively we organized relief efforts, how compassionately we treated victims, and how courageously I faced my own risk of infection. The most profound insight was that resilience grows through gradual exposure to manageable challenges rather than through avoiding all difficulty. Like a muscle that becomes stronger through progressive resistance, the mind develops capacity by facing increasingly complex problems while maintaining virtue. Each successfully navigated crisis became evidence of my ability to handle future challenges. I learned to reframe my relationship with adversity entirely. Instead of seeing problems as interruptions to my happiness, I began to view them as essential components of my development. The Germanic wars that kept me from my beloved books actually taught me leadership lessons no library could provide. The political betrayals that wounded my trust deepened my understanding of human nature and helped me become a more skillful judge of character. Mental resilience also required developing what I called multiple anchors, sources of meaning, and identity that could not be destroyed by any single loss. If my identity depended solely on being emperor, losing power would devastate me. But if I anchored my sense of self in virtue, wisdom, love, and service, no external event could completely undermine my foundation. The practice of philosophical distancing became crucial for maintaining perspective during overwhelming situations. When facing a crisis that seemed insurmountable, I would imagine how this challenge might appear to future historians, or how it compared to difficulties faced by previous generations. This temporal perspective reminded me that even my most serious problems were temporary and relative. I discovered that resilience is contagious. When I maintained inner stability during chaos, others around me felt safer and more capable. My calm presence in crisis situations gave advisors and generals permission to think clearly rather than panic. The fortress I built in my own mind became a refuge that could shelter others during storms. Building mental resilience required accepting that some damage is inevitable. The goal was not to emerge from challenges completely unscathed, but to maintain my essential integrity while integrating whatever wisdom each experience offered. Like a well-built wall that shows honorable scars from weathering many storms, a resilient mind bears marks of its battles while remaining fundamentally sound and capable of protecting what matters most. In my private study, I kept a carved skull, not as a morbid decoration, but as the most practical reminder I could possess. This simple object taught me the most liberating truth of human existence. We are all going to die, and this awareness can free us from the countless petty concerns that otherwise consume our precious time and energy. When I first began contemplating mortality, the practice felt dark and depressing. Why focus on death when life offered so many pleasures and possibilities? But gradually, I discovered that death awareness does not diminish life. It illuminates what truly matters and eliminates what merely seems important. The skull became my teacher in the art of priority and the wisdom of impermanence. Every morning I would hold this meditation object and remind myself that this day might be my last. This was not pessimistic thinking, but realistic preparation. Some morning this reminder would prove accurate. Since I could not know which morning that would be, the only rational response was to live each day with intention and presence, focusing on what I would want to remember if this were indeed my final experience. This practice transformed my relationship with both trivial irritations and major setbacks. When senators wasted time on political theater instead of addressing pressing issues, I could become angry about their short-sightedness, or I could remember that we are all temporary participants in an eternal drama. Their posturing would be forgotten within decades. What mattered was how I chose to respond with virtue and wisdom while I had the chance. The awareness of death became my ultimate counselor in decision-making. When facing difficult choices about policy or personal relationships, I would ask, if I knew I would die tomorrow, what would I do in this situation? This question cut through complexity and revealed what my deepest values demanded. Should I maintain a grudge against someone who had betrayed me, knowing that one of us might die before we could reconcile? Should I postpone expressing love to family members when this conversation might be our last? During the plague years, when death surrounded us daily, this contemplation became especially poignant and practical. I watched friends, advisors, and citizens die suddenly, without warning or preparation. Some faced death with peace and dignity, having lived according to their values. Others died with regret, having postponed important conversations, meaningful actions, and authentic relationships until someday that never came. The skull taught me that death is not the opposite of life. It is life's most reliable teacher. Everything we accomplish, acquire, or achieve will eventually be taken from us or left behind. This recognition could inspire despair or liberation, depending on how we interpret its implications. I chose to see it as freedom from attachment to outcomes I cannot ultimately control and motivation to focus on contributions I can actually make. I learned to use mortality awareness as a lens for evaluating how I spent my time and attention. Would future historians consider this Senate debate worthy of my emotional investment? Would this personal slight matter to anyone in 100 years? Would the reputation I was so carefully guarding have any significance when both I and my critics were dust? These questions helped me distinguish between authentic importance and illusory urgency. The practice also deepened my appreciation for simple pleasures and ordinary moments. Knowing that my time with my wife was limited made every conversation more precious. Understanding that my ability to serve the empire was temporary motivated me to make each decision count. Recognizing that my capacity to experience beauty, friendship, and wisdom would someday end made me more grateful for each opportunity to exercise these capacities. Death awareness paradoxically made me more alive, not less. Instead of shrinking from experience because it was temporary, I embraced it more fully because of its impermanence. A sunset is beautiful, partly because it fades. A conversation with a friend is meaningful, partly because such conversations are numbered. The empire's glory is poignant, partly because all empires eventually fall. I discovered that memento mori also serves as the great equalizer of human experience. Emperor or slave, philosopher or fool, Roman or barbarian, we all face the same ultimate destiny. This awareness bred humility about my achievements and compassion for others' struggles. Whatever differences seemed to separate us, we shared the common human condition of mortality and uncertainty. The skull reminded me daily that legacy is not about monuments or memorials, but about the virtue we practice and the love we share while we have the chance. My imperial accomplishments would eventually crumble, but the kindness I showed to a grieving citizen, the justice I dispensed to resolve a dispute, the wisdom I gained from studying philosophy, these contributions to the cosmic order would have effects that ripple forward through generations. Most profoundly, death awareness taught me that this moment, right now, as you read these words, is the only moment we can be certain we possess. The past is gone beyond recall. The future remains uncertain, but this present instant offers unlimited possibility for virtue, love, learning, and service. The skull whispered constantly, "Make this moment count, for it might be all you have." My desk sat a simple bronze chalice, unremarkable except for the profound lesson it taught me daily. This vessel, which I used for my morning wine mixed with water, became my reminder that abundance already surrounds us if we have eyes to see it. The liquid it contained was no different whether I focused on its flavor or took it for granted. but my experience of that simple pleasure depended entirely on my awareness and appreciation. Before I understood the transformative power of gratitude, I lived in a constant state of focus on what was missing, what was wrong, what needed to be fixed. The empire was too large to govern effectively, senators were too self-interested to serve the common good, barbarian tribes were too aggressive to pacify, the plague was too devastating to contain. My attention naturally gravitated toward problems, deficiencies, and threats, a perspective that made me effective at identifying challenges, but miserable at experiencing satisfaction. The practice of deliberate gratitude began as an experiment in shifting my focus from what the day might take, from me to what it had already given me. Each morning, before reviewing the scroll of urgent matters requiring imperial attention, I would look around my chambers and consciously acknowledge gifts I had been taking for granted. The privilege of literacy that allowed me to learn from philosophers across centuries, the loyalty of guards who protected me while I slept, the engineering marvels that brought fresh water to my rooms and carried waste away. This simple exercise revealed how much abundance I had been overlooking in my rush to manage scarcity. I possessed libraries that contained the wisdom of generations, advisors who brought me information from across the known world, and the authority to influence millions of lives for the better. Yet I had been so focused on the difficulties of leadership that I rarely paused to appreciate its extraordinary opportunities. I learned to find reasons for gratitude even within my greatest challenges. The Germanic wars that kept me from philosophical study also taught me lessons about courage, endurance, and human nature that no book could provide. The plague that devastated our population also revealed the remarkable capacity for heroism and compassion among ordinary citizens who risked their lives to care for the sick. The political betrayals that wounded my trust also helped me develop better judgment about character and motivation. The practice extended beyond material circumstances, to include appreciation for abstract gifts that were easily overlooked, the capacity for reason that allowed me to make sense of complex situations, the ability to feel love and friendship even amid the isolation of imperial power, the opportunity to practice virtue regardless of external circumstances, the possibility of learning and growing through every experience, whether pleasant or painful. I discovered that gratitude is not just a pleasant emotion, but a practical tool for psychological health and effectiveness. When I began my days by acknowledging what was working well, I approached problems with greater confidence and creativity. When I noticed beauty and goodness already present in my life, I felt less desperate about acquiring more pleasure or avoiding all pain. This shifted my energy from anxious grasping to generous contribution. The chalice taught me that gratitude must be practiced consciously because our minds naturally focus on threats, problems, and insufficiencies. This negativity bias served our ancestors well when survival depended on vigilant attention to danger, but it creates unnecessary suffering in circumstances where basic needs are met. Without deliberate cultivation of appreciation, we can possess great wealth, yet feel impoverished, enjoy significant accomplishments, yet feel unsuccessful. During the darkest periods of my reign, gratitude became a lifeline to sanity and hope. When military campaigns dragged on longer than expected and casualties mounted beyond acceptable levels, I could find reasons to appreciate the courage of soldiers, the skill of commanders, and the resilience of families enduring separation. When political opposition seemed determined to block every constructive policy, I could be grateful for the democratic principles that allowed such dissent and the opportunity to persuade, rather than simply command. I learned to practice what I called comparative gratitude, imagining how my current circumstances might appear to people facing greater hardships. When frustrated by the pace of administrative reform, I would think of citizens whose entire families had died in the plague. When annoyed by luxuries that failed to meet my expectations, I would remember soldiers sleeping on frozen ground during frontier campaigns. This perspective shift instantly transformed minor irritations into occasions for appreciation. The practice also revealed how gratitude multiplies when shared with others. When I expressed genuine appreciation to advisors for their service, their motivation and effectiveness increased. When I acknowledged the sacrifices of military families, their loyalty deepened. When I celebrated the achievements of provincial governors, their commitment to excellence strengthened. Gratitude was not just personally beneficial, it was a leadership tool that brought out the best in everyone around me. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that gratitude is a choice available in any circumstance. We cannot always control what happens to us, but we can always control what we choose to notice and appreciate within our experience. Even during periods of intense suffering, we retain the capacity to acknowledge whatever light remains. The kindness of a friend, the beauty of a sunset, the simple fact of being conscious in an extraordinary universe. Spread across my campaign table lay the detailed battle maps that guided our military strategies, each mark representing thousands of lives, each decision carrying consequences that would ripple through generations. These maps taught me that effective action requires clear purpose, careful planning, and unwavering commitment to virtue, regardless of external pressures or personal costs. The discipline of action, I discovered, is not about doing more things or moving faster. It is about aligning every choice with your deepest values and acting with courage when virtue demands it, even when such action is difficult, unpopular, or seemingly disadvantageous. This principle was tested repeatedly during my reign, forcing me to choose between what was easy and what was right, between political expediency and moral integrity. When the plague devastated our empire, many advisors counseled me to prioritize protecting the wealthy districts of Rome while letting the disease run its course among the poor. From a purely strategic perspective, this made sense. Preserving the educated and powerful classes would maintain stability and economic recovery. But my philosophical training demanded a different response. Justice required that imperial resources serve all citizens equally, regardless of their social status or political influence. I chose to distribute medical supplies and food assistance based on need rather than social rank, knowing this decision would anger wealthy supporters and strain imperial finances. The maps on my table showed me the practical challenges of this choice, but they also reminded me that leadership means serving the common good even when powerful constituencies prefer otherwise. The discipline of action meant doing what virtue demanded despite the political costs. This same principle guided my approach to military campaigns against Germanic tribes. Many generals recommended punitive expeditions designed to terrorize enemies into submission through maximum brutality. Such tactics might achieve short-term compliance while requiring fewer resources and risking fewer Roman lives. But my study of philosophy had taught me that means determine ends, that how we achieve goals shapes what those achievements ultimately mean. I insisted on conducting warfare according to principles of justice and proportionality, treating prisoners humanely and seeking diplomatic solutions whenever possible. This approach was often criticized as weakness by those who confused cruelty with strength, but I had learned that true power lies in acting according to virtue even when vice appears. More practical. The discipline of action also required learning to act decisively despite incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. As emperor, I faced countless situations where delay meant allowing problems to worsen, yet hasty decisions could create greater difficulties. The battle maps taught me to gather the best information available, consult with wise advisors, then act courageously based on principles rather than paralyzed by unknowns. When reports reached me of corruption among provincial governors, I faced a choice between conducting lengthy investigations that might allow guilty parties to escape or taking swift action based on preliminary evidence that might punish innocent officials. I chose to act quickly but proportionally, removing officials from positions where they could cause further harm while ensuring they received fair hearings to determine appropriate consequences. I learned that the discipline of action often requires doing unpopular things for good reasons rather than popular things for bad reasons. When senators proposed reducing taxes to gain public favor while knowing this would cripple military defenses, I had to choose between short-term popularity and long-term security. The maps showed clearly that barbarian threats were real and growing. Responsible leadership demanded maintaining adequate funding for frontier protection despite inevitable citizen complaints. The most challenging aspect of virtuous action was learning to act without attachment to results. I could control the quality of my decisions and the virtue of my intentions, but I could not guarantee specific outcomes. Military campaigns might fail despite excellent planning. Well-intentioned policies might produce unintended consequences. Just decisions might be misunderstood or criticized by those they were designed to help. This detachment from results was not indifference to consequences. I cared deeply about the empire's welfare and worked tirelessly to achieve positive outcomes. But I learned to find satisfaction in acting virtuously regardless of external validation or immediate success. If I made decisions based on wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, I could maintain peace of mind even when circumstances beyond my control prevented ideal results. The battle maps also taught me that effective action requires balancing immediate needs with long-term vision. Emergency responses to current crises were necessary, but they had to be coordinated with sustainable strategies for lasting improvement. When addressing plague disruption of food supplies, I had to both organize immediate relief and develop better systems for preventing future shortages. I discovered that the discipline of action becomes easier with practice. Each time I chose virtue over convenience, the next such choice required less internal struggle. Each time I acted courageously, despite fear, courage became more natural. The maps recorded not just military campaigns, but my personal campaign to become the kind of leader and human being my highest values demanded. Most importantly, I learned that we demonstrate our true character not through our intentions or words, but through our actions under pressure. Anyone can claim to value justice when it costs nothing. Virtue is proven by choosing justice when it requires sacrifice. The discipline of action transformed abstract philosophical principles into lived reality, making me accountable to my deepest beliefs about what kind of life is worth living. On parchment worn smooth by countless revisions, I wrote and rewrote the principles that would guide my life, not as rigid dogma, but as a living document that evolved with experience and deepening wisdom. This personal creed became my compass through the complexities of imperial leadership and human existence, providing direction when circumstances were unclear and courage when choices were difficult. Creating a personal philosophy is not about adopting someone else's beliefs wholesale, but about distilling your own understanding of what makes life meaningful and virtuous. I drew from Stoic teachings, but I also integrated insights from my own experience as emperor, father, and human being, facing the universal challenges of mortality, responsibility, and relationship. The foundation of my personal philosophy rested on 4 cardinal virtues that I refined through years of practical application. Wisdom meant not just acquiring knowledge, but developing the judgment to apply it skillfully in complex situations. Justice required treating all people fairly regardless of their status, serving the common good even when it conflicted with personal interest. Courage involved facing difficulties with integrity rather than avoiding them through compromise or dishonesty. Temperance meant finding balance in all things, neither pursuing pleasure obsessively nor rejecting it completely. But beyond these classical virtues, I developed principles specific to my circumstances and temperament. As someone prone to perfectionism and control, I needed constant reminders that excellence is more important than perfection, that influence matters more than control. As a leader responsible for others' welfare, I needed guidelines for making decisions that balanced competing interests and long-term consequences. My personal creed included practical maxims that proved invaluable during daily challenges. Assume positive intent until proven otherwise helped me respond to criticism and conflict with curiosity rather than defensiveness. Ask what this situation can teach me transformed setbacks into opportunities for growth. A focus on contribution rather than recognition kept my ego from corrupting my service to others. I learned to test these principles against real-world experience, refining them when they proved inadequate or impractical. Early versions of my philosophy emphasized emotional detachment to an extreme that made me seem cold and disconnected from others. Through trial and error, I discovered that compassionate engagement was more effective than stoic withdrawal, that showing appropriate emotion actually strengthened rather than undermined my leadership. The process of creating personal philosophy required honest self-examination about my strengths, weaknesses, and blind spots. I had to acknowledge my tendency toward impatience with incompetence, my struggle with delegating authority, my inclination to take criticism too personally. Understanding these patterns allowed me to develop specific practices for managing them constructively. I found that writing down my beliefs forced me to clarify what I actually thought versus what I assumed I thought. The act of putting principles into words revealed contradictions and gaps in my reasoning. Did I really believe that all people deserve equal treatment? Or did I make exceptions for those who served my interests? Did my actions align with my stated values, or was I deceiving myself about my true motivations? The personal creed also had to address the inevitable tensions between different values and competing goods. How do I balance honesty with kindness when truth might cause unnecessary pain? How do I reconcile individual freedom with collective responsibility? How do I maintain hope while accepting that many problems cannot be solved? These dilemmas required nuanced thinking rather than simple rules. I discovered that philosophy is most useful when it provides guidance for specific situations rather than abstract speculation about general principles. What does justice look like when deciding how to allocate limited resources during a crisis? How does courage manifest when facing criticism for unpopular but necessary decisions? How does wisdom operate when choosing between imperfect options with uncertain consequences? My personal philosophy evolved through dialogue with others as well as solitary reflection. Conversations with advisors, family members, and even critics helped me understand different perspectives and refine my own thinking. I learned that holding my beliefs lightly, being willing to revise them based on new evidence or experience, actually strengthened rather than weakened my philosophical foundation. The creed included not just principles for decision-making, but practices for daily living, morning meditation to prepare my mind for challenges, evening reflection to process experiences and extract lessons, regular reading to expose myself to wisdom from other sources, physical exercise to maintain the health necessary for service, gratitude practice to maintain perspective on my privileges and opportunities. Most importantly, I learned that personal philosophy must be lived rather than merely believed. The test of any principle is not whether it sounds noble in discussion, but whether it provides useful guidance when facing real difficulties. A philosophy that works only in ideal circumstances is academic speculation. One that sustains you through crisis and complexity is practical wisdom. The parchment reminded me that philosophy is not a destination, but a journey, not a fixed set of answers, but an ongoing process of inquiry and refinement. Each experience offered opportunities to deepen understanding. Each mistake provided chances to improve judgment. Each success created possibilities for greater service. My personal creed became not a burden of rigid expectations, but a flexible framework for continuous growth toward virtue and wisdom. Looking across the centuries from my ancient world to yours, I see that while the external circumstances of human life have changed dramatically, the fundamental challenges remain remarkably constant. You may carry a device more powerful than all the libraries of Alexandria in your pocket, yet you still struggle with anxiety about the future, frustration with difficult people, and the search for meaning amid suffering and uncertainty. The bridge between ancient Stoic wisdom and modern application lies in recognizing that the same principles that helped me govern an empire can help you navigate your career, relationships, and personal growth. The techniques that sustained me through plagues and wars can sustain you through workplace stress, family conflicts, and the daily pressures of contemporary life. When you feel overwhelmed by your workload, remember my morning preparation ritual. Before checking your messages or diving into urgent tasks, take a few moments to set your intentions for the day. Remind yourself that you will encounter difficult people, unexpected problems, and situations beyond your control. Prepare mentally to respond with virtue rather than react with emotion. This simple practice transforms your entire experience of challenging days. The discipline of desire proves especially relevant in your consumer-driven culture. Your society constantly messages that happiness comes from acquiring more money, more status, more possessions, more experiences. Yet I learned that contentment comes from wanting what you already have, rather than always seeking more of what you lack. Practice gratitude for your current circumstances while working to improve them, but don't make your peace of mind dependent on external achievements. In your relationships, apply the principle of loving detachment. You can care deeply about family members, friends, and colleagues while accepting that you cannot control their choices, moods, or responses to your efforts. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent. It means loving people for who they are, rather than trying to make them who you think they should be. You'll find your relationships actually improve when others feel accepted, rather than constantly judged or managed. The practice of present moment awareness becomes crucial in your age of constant distraction. Your devices compete for attention, with notifications, alerts, and an endless stream of information. Yet peace and effectiveness still require the same focused presence I cultivated with my hourglass. During conversations, resist the urge to check your phone. When eating, taste your food rather than scrolling through social media. When walking, notice your surroundings rather than mentally rehearsing future conversations. Modern work environments provide countless opportunities to practice the obstacle as pathway principle. When projects encounter unexpected complications, ask how these challenges might actually improve the final result. When colleagues resist your ideas, consider how their objections might help you refine and strengthen your proposals. When you face criticism or setbacks, look for the growth opportunities hidden within apparent failures. Your evening review practice might involve examining how you spent your time and attention throughout the day. Did you react to emails immediately or respond thoughtfully after reflection? Did you let others' moods determine your emotional state, or did you maintain inner stability regardless of external circumstances? What triggered your strongest emotional reactions, and how might you respond more skillfully to similar situations in the future? The discipline of action applies powerfully to your career and personal goals. Focus on what you can control: your effort, your attitude, your skills development, your contribution to projects, rather than what you cannot control: your boss's recognition, your company's decisions, other people's opinions of your work. This shift reduces anxiety while actually increasing your effectiveness and satisfaction. In dealing with difficult people in your modern context, remember that they are acting according to their own reasoning, fears, and circumstances. The colleague who takes credit for your work may be insecure about their own competence. The family member who criticizes your choices may be expressing their own unfulfilled dreams. Understanding these motivations allows you to respond with wisdom rather than react with anger. Your version of memento mori might involve regularly reflecting on life's temporary nature, not to become morbid, but to maintain perspective on what truly matters. Will the workplace drama consuming your thoughts today matter in 5 years? Are you postponing important conversations or experiences until someday that might never come? How would you live differently if you knew you had only 1 year remaining? The practice of philosophical detachment proves especially valuable in your achievement-oriented culture. You can pursue professional success, financial security, and personal goals wholeheartedly while remaining emotionally detached from specific outcomes. Work with excellence, but don't derive your self-worth from external validation. Strive for promotion, but maintain your dignity whether or not you receive it. Your gratitude practice might focus on advantages you take for granted, access to education, healthcare, technology, and opportunities that would seem miraculous to most humans throughout history. You live longer, healthier, more connected lives than emperors of my era could imagine. This perspective can transform complaints about minor inconveniences into appreciation for extraordinary privileges. The bridge between my ancient world and your modern life is built on the recognition that virtue, wisdom, courage, and justice remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. The external stage may change, but the human drama of choosing between wisdom and folly, virtue and vice, love and fear continues. The same philosophical tools that help me maintain inner peace while governing an empire can help you maintain inner peace while navigating your own complex responsibilities and relationships. As I prepare to leave you with these final reflections, I place in your hands the most precious gift I can offer, the key to your own inner citadel. This key is not made of bronze or gold, but of understanding, practice, and the courage to live according to your highest values, regardless of external circumstances. The journey toward inner mastery that I have shared with you is not a destination you arrive at once and remain there forever. It is a daily practice, a moment-by-moment choice to respond with wisdom rather than react with impulse, to act from virtue rather than fear, to find peace within yourself rather than demand it from the world around you. When I began this path as a young man overwhelmed by the responsibilities of empire, I thought Stoic philosophy was about becoming invulnerable to suffering. I imagined that mastering these principles would eliminate all emotional pain and make me impervious to life's inevitable challenges. What I discovered instead was something far more valuable, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of an unshakable foundation that could weather any storm. You now possess the same tools that sustained me through plague and war, betrayal and loss, the burden of leadership and the approach of death. The morning preparation ritual that sets your intention for each day. The practice of present moment awareness that anchors you in the only time you can actually influence. The discipline of desire that frees you from the tyranny of external validation. The evening review that transforms every experience into wisdom. These are not merely techniques for managing stress or achieving greater productivity. They are doorways to a fundamentally different way of experiencing human existence, one in which your peace of mind depends on your character rather than your circumstances. Your happiness flows from your virtue rather than your achievements. Your strength comes from accepting what you cannot control while courageously influencing what you can. The path ahead will test everything you have learned. There will be days when practicing these principles feels natural and effortless, when you move through challenges with grace and respond to difficulties with wisdom. There will also be days when you forget everything, when you react with old patterns of anger, anxiety, or attachment. This is not failure. It is the human condition. What matters is not perfection, but persistence. Each time you catch yourself reacting and choose to respond instead, you strengthen your inner citadel. Each time you transform an obstacle into an opportunity for growth, you prove to yourself that external events cannot determine your internal state. Each time you practice gratitude in difficult circumstances, you demonstrate that contentment is a choice available in any moment. Remember that this wisdom was never meant to be hoarded in isolation, but shared through example. As you develop greater inner stability, others will notice the difference in how you handle pressure, treat difficult people, and maintain perspective during chaos. Your calm presence will give them permission to respond rather than react. Your virtue will inspire them to seek their own path to wisdom. The world needs people who have found their inner citadel, leaders who can think clearly during crisis, friends who can offer genuine support without being overwhelmed by others. Problems, family members who can love without controlling, workers who can contribute excellently without being destroyed by criticism or failure. You are joining a tradition that stretches across centuries, ordinary people who discovered extraordinary inner strength through philosophical practice. We face different external challenges, but we develop the same internal capacities that you are now cultivating. What united us was not our circumstances, but our commitment to responding to whatever life presented with virtue, wisdom, courage, and justice. The key to the inner citadel requires no special talent or advantageous circumstances. It asks only that you begin where you are with what you have, facing whatever challenges currently demand your attention. Whether you are governing an empire or managing a household, leading armies, or raising children, the principles remain the same because human nature remains the same. Your inner citadel is both your refuge and your contribution to the world. From this place of inner stability, you can serve others more effectively, love more freely, work more excellently, and face uncertainty more courageously. You become not someone who has eliminated all problems, but someone who can handle any problem with grace. This is my final gift to you, not a guarantee that life will be easy, but the assurance that you possess everything necessary to live well, regardless of what circumstances arise. The fortress of your inner strength is built one choice at a time, one moment at a time, one response at a time. Take the key, open the door, begin the practice. The path to inner mastery starts with your very next breath, your very next choice, your very next opportunity to live according to the wisdom we have shared. May you find the peace that surpasses all understanding and the strength that no external force can diminish.